It all started when different telescopes, looking at the same point in the sky at the same hour, produced different frames of the same nucleus. In Europe, the shift at the VLT in Paranal was finishing their cold coffee when a batch of frames arrived from the server. On first viewing, the core looked elongated, like a short rod with soft edges. Almost simultaneously on the other side of the planet, the Subaru team unloaded its series. There, the core was a near-perfect point with a neat symmetry as if it weren't a comet, but a distant star with a slight halo. Conventional logic suggests a simple explanation. Different instruments, different optics, different atmospheres. But too many details didn't add up here to chalk it all up to, well, it happens. The exposures matched, the orientations matched, the start times of the series differed by minutes, not hours. Even the filters were coordinated in advance, because at that hour the entire world was working according to a single plan. The strangest thing is, both teams filmed raw footage. Not pretty press posters, but diagnostic shots. The kind where you can still see the noise, hot pixels, cosmic ray traces, and grime of real work. On the VLT, the elongated core remained stable. Not just one frame, not two. The entire series showed the same geometry, as if the object were deliberately maintaining its shape as long as it was viewed that way. On the Subaru, the point also held steady, and that was what was most annoying. If it were the atmosphere, the shape would fluctuate. If it were the processing, different operators would get different results. But here, it's ironclad repeatability. It wasn't the theoreticians who were the first to get nervous, but the engineers. Because different pictures can still be tolerated. But when different pictures become equally stable within each device, it feels like a rule, not a bug. Someone in the Paranal chat said something they don't usually log, looks like two different objects, and then quickly added, no, not two. Same distance, same coordinates. Then we turn to what's always reserved for a last resort, comparisons between background stars and the PSF. If the core is elongated but the PSF is round, that's not a question of optics. It's a question of the source. The PSF was normal. The background stars behaved as expected. The atmosphere was breathing, but not enough to draw a stick in one place, and a perfect dot in another, much less synchronously across the planet. Almost imperceptibly, the conversation shifted to a language that sounds dry but smells of anxiety. Source model, core segmentation, internal component, superposition. During the third round of testing, one of the analysts suggested a simple, almost childish test. Let's pretend the core is two dots next to each other. Let's see what the fits say. If it were a binary nucleus, different apertures would see it differently. A larger aperture would separate the two components, a smaller one would merge them into one. This sounded logical, and importantly, it sounded reassuring. The VLT fits suddenly agreed. Two components, very close, one weaker. The math was smiling. But on the Subaru, the same model fell apart. There, the data stubbornly demanded a single point. Then they did something they usually don't do without a reason. They requested footage from a third party, one with a completely different surveillance, physics, not optics. Radio. Alma's answer was inconclusive. In the millimeter range, the object appeared as a compact source with a slight tail, but without obvious doubleness. Moreover, the signal strength breathed slightly, evenly. Breathing is a bad word for space. In space, everything is either noisy or physically changing. But here there was a rhythm, precise as a metronome, not loud, but too steady to be ignored. While the scientists argued, the technical coordinators did their job. They checked the times to rule out the odd thing, a different point, an ephemeris error, a shift of a fraction of an arcsecond. Any little thing. They found no details. The coordinates matched, the time matched, the speed across the sky matched, and that was worse than any error they'd found, because now there was nothing left to argue about. All that was left was to look at the facts. At the same hour, a packet arrived in the system from a small private project where people were filming with a 1.5 meter telescope without a big name. Their footage showed the third version of the kernel. Not a stick, not a dot. Something in between. A compact, bright core and a barely noticeable shelf of light nearby, as if the object has a protrusion that sometimes appears, sometimes disappears. This shelf could have been attributed to processing, but the private contractor sent raw images. And the most annoying thing, the shelf appeared in the same place relative to the core over a series of dozens of frames. It would seem that the picture fits together like a simple puzzle. A binary core, a coma, jets, and frequency range features. But then something happened that shatters any simple puzzle. When the teams exchanged raw matrices rather than images, it became clear that the difference was visible even before processing. Not in the final, beautiful images, but in the original photons. It was like when you're arguing about the color of a light bulb, and then you open the spectrometer and see that the bulb actually shines differently depending on who's looking at it. The word dependency sounds normal in science, but here the dependence wasn't on a filter or a range. It was on the instrument as a personality, as if the object recognizes what it's being viewed with. The internal chat quickly ceased to be a place for jokes. Short messages appeared that no one likes to write, stop publishing, close access to drafts, approval via coordinator, and just then, right on schedule, NASA issued a simple statement. No signs of unusual behavior were detected. It sounded too smooth, too early, and too confident. People who worked with the data read it differently. We're not ready to discuss this. Not everything's fine, but not right now. This is always felt in the pace and how quickly the topic is closed. Half an hour later, an email arrived marked urgent to addresses not typically found in regular mailings. It contained just a few lines. Gather representatives from key observatories for a closed call. Formally, it's calibration verification. Informally, it's our object behaves as if it's adjusting its mass to each telescope, and this is visible in the raw material. On the call, everyone spoke cautiously but quickly, and the more cautiously they spoke, the clearer the mood became. No one wanted to be the first to say their thoughts out loud, but they were already hanging in the air, because core substitution isn't about form. It's about display control. It's about the source seemingly being able to manipulate what we call the observed image. One of the senior analysts proposed the most disturbing hypothesis that can be uttered without sounding like science fiction: brightness modulation by aperture. That is, the object emits radiation in such a way as to hit different systems differently. It sounds like nonsense until you remember one simple thing. Aperture isn't just more light, it's different spatial frequencies, a different way of reading structure. If an object has a small-scale structure that switches on and off according to a pattern, then one device will see it as an elongation, another will merge it into a point, and a third will notice a shelf. And all this can happen without a single magical law. All that's needed is a source that can control the fine details of its luminescence or short-term emissions. The next question immediately arose, cold and very practical. Why then is it synchronous? Why exactly at the same hour, when it flies closer, when we have gathered the global network into one fist? The answer that no one wanted to hear was too direct, because at that hour they were all looking at him at the same time, and he took it into account. I didn't mystically feel a gaze. Instead, I received a stream of radar, laser rangefinders, spectral lines, attempts at illumination, and calibrations. All of these are signals in the environment. Even if we're silent, we shine. Even if we're just observing, we leave an imprint, schedules, coordination, frequency, especially when we work in sync. And here, the core substitution ceased to be a beautiful riddle for the astroforum. It became a hint that the object understands the difference between a solitary gaze and a collective observation. Then someone on the call suggested a control experiment, which, in theory, should have calmed everything down. Let's break the synchronization. Let each location film at its own timing. The idea was simple. If it's systematic, it won't depend on a schedule. If it's an object's response to a general pattern, then staggering the timing could break the effect. They agreed quickly, too quickly for science. When science rushes, it means someone nearby no longer perceives it as calm research. The site's timings diverged. Observation windows became jagged. Some took images earlier, some later. And at that moment, a slight shift occurred in the VLT graphs. The elongated core became almost a point for a couple of bursts. Not completely, but enough to silence the room, because it looked as if the object was actually changing modes. And during the same period, the Subaru dot suddenly showed a hint of asymmetry, that very shelf previously seen only by private buyers, and this no longer fit into the data problems. Now comes the most unpleasant part of the story, where everything becomes not just strange, but almost personal, because the substitution ceased to be a random effect. It began to respond to our actions. And it was at this moment, when the world first tried to break the general pattern of observation, that a short line appeared in the log of one space instrument that was impossible to interpret without a shudder. Not an exposure error, not a communications glitch, a systemic event, like a security response, as if someone up there realized we're now doing things we shouldn't be doing simultaneously. And while official channels continued to talk about calibrations, the internal question became quite simple and terrifying. If the core can look different to different telescopes, then which of these faces is the real one? And another question, even worse, what if we have never seen the real face at all? The line in the log looked mundane, even boring. No anomalies of the century, no red flags, simply a system event. A security algorithm triggered a threshold that shouldn't have been there. The threshold wasn't brightness, it wasn't overheating, it wasn't memory. It was signal geometry, the way the source structure changed frame by frame, as if someone was deliberately tearing the image into narrow frequencies. And at that moment, a familiar chill gripped the room. That chill when you realize, for the first time, we're dealing not with an object, but with behavior. Not with the physics of ice, but with a reaction to observation. Someone muttered, "It looks like pattern blindness," and immediately added, "I know how it sounds." But the log doesn't lie. It doesn't see brightness. It sees a pattern. The next 10 minutes were spent in an unpleasant routine. Everyone was doing the same thing, checking to see if they could have created this pattern themselves. Flat field error, poor jitter correction, incorrect tracking, too pure, too synchronized. And most importantly, the pattern only emerged when the observations attempted to become incoherent, fragmented, and independent. It was as if the object wasn't concerned with the mass of telescopes, but rather that the telescopes had stopped playing the same game, as if it preferred us in formation. And when the formation broke, a different mode was activated. On the NASA internal call, no one mentioned the words camouflage or deception. Other terms were mentioned: adaptive imaging, instrument-dependent visual structure, behavioral correlation. But the essence was the same. The core looked different not because we weren't looking hard enough, but because the object allowed for different responses to different modes of observation. The first attempt to bring everything back to normal was a simple rule. Don't discuss form, discuss energy. If the VLT has a stick and the Subaru has a dot, then the integral flux must match. They compared the photometry. They compared it on the same stars, with identical apertures, as much as possible. And what they got was something that made you want to curse out loud. The total brightness matched, and in other words, the object seemed to retain its light budget, but redistributed it within the image. It gave structure to one device, while the other smoothed everything into a compact core. This no longer resembles a random comet. It resembles a system that can maintain its overall power by varying the microscopic organization of its glow and emissions. And then, someone remembered an old story from radio physics. If a source radiates coherently and controls phase, it can look different for different apertures and baselines. We don't need magic. We need control. We need stable regimes. And that word, regimes, has been cropping up too often in 3 Atlas's logs in recent days. While they were arguing, a message arrived from the team working on the radar observations. The text was short and crisp. There's a stable return. Not a coma. Not dust. Stable structure. This phrase would once have been just another argument between radio amateurs and opticians, but after the core swap, it became part of the same pattern. If radar sees structure and optics see different shapes in the same hour, the question becomes not who made a mistake, but what exactly are we being shown when we look? And here, everything suddenly took a turn that's more frightening than any beautiful hypothesis, because at the same time, almost simultaneously, another small detail surfaced in the archives. One of the space telescopes, which was supposed to provide the cleanest, atmosphere-free image, went into protective mode just before the observation was scheduled to minutes. Officially, it was dismissed as a regular glitch, a blockage, a reboot, a technical detail. No one makes stories about things like that unless you're paranoid, but the people inside didn't need to fabricate legends. They had telemetry, and the telemetry showed not chaos, but repetition, as if the system was receiving the same external stimulus. The irritation came not as a blow, but as a sequence, small peaks, the same pitch, the same duration. Too smooth to be simply cosmic. Someone on the call said something that is usually only said in closed rooms. If this is active protection, then someone tried to highlight it. Backlighting comes in different forms. Laser, radar, spectral. Sometimes it's not even called backlighting, but referred to as a calibration series. From the outside, it all looks innocent. But inside, it looks like an experiment to see how an object reacts when a signal of a certain structure is directed at it. And the most disturbing thing, the object didn't just react, it seemed it responded. Because immediately after the spacecraft went into protective mode, the core substitution in optical sequences on Earth became more pronounced. It was as if the object had entered a more severe mode. The VLT's beam became shorter but brighter, as if the structure had been compressed. The Subaru's dot became more perfect, as if the smoothing had become stronger, and the shelf on the privately owned models disappeared completely. It's as if someone had obscured the unnecessary details, leaving only 2 masks, the elongated one and the pinpoint one, 2 roles for 2 types of views, minimum information, maximum control. At that moment, it became clear why NASA had so quickly issued the phrase, "nothing unusual." It wasn't about calm, it was about the fact that public discussion was undermining the situation's management. Because if dozens of observatories start changing modes, timings, and ranges unpredictably, it will become more difficult to find a face for an object. This means that the value of chaos for us increases. And that's precisely why, after the first hint of desynchronization, the opposite happened internally. Pressure for coordination. Restore a unified plan. Pretend it's for science, when it's actually for control purposes. At the wording level, everything seemed decent. Data comparison is necessary. A unified methodology is needed. Reducing systematics. Everything is correct, everything is scientific, but on a sensory level, it sounded different. Get everyone back in line. Leave no holes, because holes are where the real structure is visible. One of the young researchers, not used to keeping quiet, asked bluntly, if it's just a comet, why are we afraid of chaos? We should be celebrating our independence. They didn't give him an answer, they gave him a pause, and the pause said more than any words. In scientific conversations, a pause is a sign that the question has hit a sore spot. Then the senior coordinator calmly said, "We're not afraid of chaos. We're afraid of erroneous conclusions." And at that moment, many realized that erroneous conclusion sounded like a euphemism, because a false conclusion is when you misjudge mass or velocity. But here the error could have been different, that we believed the image we were shown, and this brought us back to the simplest, most vile question. Not what is this, but who controls the image? When this question was asked aloud in a private channel, one engineer sent a file. No comment, just the file and a short message. Phase frequency comparison, take a look. There was something there that made the hairs on your arm stand up quietly, without any drama. The data showed a weak but consistent periodic component, consistent across several sites. Not stellar pulsations, not atmospheric drift. The component was located precisely in the core and appeared precisely at the moment of the switch, as if the core were slightly modulated in brightness. Not just any modulation, but a modulation with a very precise structure, as if someone were using light as a carrier and the core shape as a screen. Too bold? Yes. But then they remembered something else. A false star near Atlas, a point source that lingers relative to the comet and disappears as orderly as it appears. If there is a point source nearby and the core shows modulations, then suddenly a picture emerges in which the core is not a single piece of ice, but a bunch of components working together. Then the different shapes for different telescopes cease to be mystical. It becomes a question of configuration, which component dominates for which aperture and which base. And the scariest part, this can be done deliberately. You can highlight one component when a wide pupil looks at you, and extinguish it when another one looks at you. At this point, the conversation broke off because another notification arrived. It wasn't from science. It was from services that don't usually contact astronomers. The message was brief. Any publication of raw data for the December 21st window requires approval. No explanation, no request, not a recommendation, but an order. And now, the nuclear substitution is no longer a mystery at the telescope level. It has become an event at the information management level. The leak didn't start with a leak, but with a familiar gesture. An astrophotographer from Europe asked a curator he knew, "Give me the raw images, I'll check if the detail was ruined by aggressive processing." He received not just one file, but a whole stack of FITS images, all shot in the same window. These shots weren't supposed to be used at all. There were no filters applied, no makeup, no smoothing for the press release, just the raw math of the sensor and what actually hit the pixels. The most terrifying thing is that the third version of the core wasn't found at the edges, in the noise, or in questionable shots. It showed up right in the sequence where the tracking was perfect, and the stars in the reference field were perfectly positioned. It wasn't a rod or a dot, it was a double center. It was as if the core had two brightness nodes, very close to each other, but consistently separated by the same angle. In a normal comet, this could be explained by fragmentation, but fragmentation creates chaos. The distance increases, the brightness fluctuates, the coma spreads. Here, everything was held together like a ruler. He superimposed the frames, aligned them with the stars, and applied the same deconvolution. The two nodes didn't disappear, they only became clear, as if the processing weren't creating the structure, but rather defogging it. Then he did what people do when they're already feeling uneasy inside. He compared it to another site, another country, another camera, and he saw the same double center at the same time, with the same orientation. At this point, the story should have become scientific, writing a note, collecting statistics, checking for errors. But reality took a different turn, because the files had already moved on, to closed chats where people don't know how to wait. The first post was dry, raw footage. December 21st window, there's a third form of the core. The second was worse, double node, stable, not an artifact. And then began an avalanche of reposts without names or links. 40 minutes after the files first appeared in chats, a strange coincidence occurred. 5 independent accounts, usually posting astronomy, simultaneously deleted their posts and posted the same message. Processing error. They couldn't have reached an agreement so quickly. They couldn't have formulated the same thing so coldly. And they certainly couldn't have all suddenly realized they'd made a mistake without double checking. Almost immediately after this, the same astrophotographer tried again to access the cloud from where he'd retrieved fits. Access was denied. Not no permissions, but file doesn't exist. It was as if the entire folder had been ripped out. He wrote to the curator. The reply was a single sentence: "Don't ask anything. Just forget you saw it." Not a threat, not hysteria. The tone of a man already on edge. The most disturbing thing happened an hour later, not on the internet, but in the data. New observations made in the next window suddenly lost this dual center. It was as if the core had again chosen two masks, the stick and the dot. Moreover, the disappearance was not smooth, but discrete. One series has nodes, the next series has none. No disintegration or flight. Simply a mode switch, like the flick of a switch. And if you try to cling to natural explanations, this place breaks you gently. Because nature doesn't switch fragmentation on a schedule. Nature doesn't return an object to its pure form immediately after a leak. Then, in the room where the closed call was taking place, one person said something that is usually not said out loud. If he can change the visible structure, it means he is tracking how people are looking at him. From that moment on, everyone started looking not at pretty shots, but at metadata, at precise timings, at delays, at the sequence in which telescope modes were changed, at where filters were installed, at where calibrations were performed. And a pattern emerged that makes you want to step away from the monitor. The third form of the kernel appeared precisely when the observation became unofficial. Inconsistent exposures, non-standard frequencies, extra frames in a series. And when the observations were organized into a beautiful, coherent plan, two forms remained, perfectly suited to the two camps. For some, it was an elongated core and a jet. For others, it was a compact point and a calm coma. It's as if the object itself chose two narratives that are easier to swallow. One for those who believe in an active comet, the other for those who believe in a simple, dull rock, and both narratives are harmless. But the third form was dangerous because it hinted at a composite structure, a bundle of elements, that there might be a false star nearby, and that the core itself wasn't a single piece of matter. And here's where an old term from another field popped up. Not from comets or astrophotography, but from systems engineering. Sensor mask. When the system doesn't attack, but simply feeds different sensors, different images. Such a system doesn't have to be intelligent in the human sense. It only needs to be automated, aware of which types of observations are dangerous and able to switch to a safe mode when such observations begin. That's why the space telescope's shutdown was no longer a glitch. It became part of the same logic. When someone tried to illuminate or record a spectrum too deeply, the system was irritated and shut down. 2 hours after the leak, a new detail emerged. Not a picture, not a spectrum, a list of restrictions. It spread through internal channels so quickly, it seemed it had been anticipated. There were specific points: frequency restrictions, continuous burst length restrictions, and a ban on certain high contrast shooting modes in specific windows. It all seemed like error prevention, but anyone who's ever seen technical restrictions written in aviation or communications recognizes the style. It's how people write things when they don't want to accidentally see something again that's already been revealed. And that same night, the core substitution continued. Because at two sites that weren't included in the list and were working according to the old plan, the core again gave way to a third form. Not for long, for 3 frames. 3 frames were enough to notice something else. The angle between the nodes wasn't random. It was repeated with an accuracy of fractions of a degree, as if they were 2 elements of a fixed structure. And then everything disappeared again, as if someone realized they'd leaked not just the files, but the form as well, and they reverted to the secure masks that prevent us from piecing together the whole picture. The worst question in this story isn't, what is it? The worst question is, why is it so careful to limit what we can independently confirm? Because the comet doesn't argue with the methodology. The comet doesn't adapt to different instruments. The comet doesn't change its face after someone pulls the raw footage out from under lock and key. And then something happened that no one expected, even in the most nervous discussions. The next day, one of the largest ground-based telescopes received a schedule update. No explanation, simply a change of target to a different window. And with that, almost simultaneously, the false star near Atlas reappeared. Right at the edge of visibility, at a level that could be dismissed as noise, and yet it was spotted in 3 places at once. It felt less like a fluke and more like a test, as if the object were testing how quickly you'd pull yourself together if it threw you a bait but didn't let you hook on. Then a familiar trace surfaced in the telemetry of one instrument, the same small peaks, the same pitch, the same stimulus duration, as if someone was trying to reach the object with a signal again, and it was as if the object responded again, but differently. Not by entering safe mode, but by a subtle shift in structure, almost imperceptible, yet synchronized across various instruments. A shift that looked like as an attempt to reduce our observations back into one picture that is convenient for him. And it was here, during this normalization, that people's hands trembled for the first time. Because a device's error doesn't behave like a politician. An error doesn't choose what to hide, and it doesn't tailor its form to fit the usual explanations. At that moment, no one on the ground was shouting aliens. On the ground, the words were more boring and frightening. We are beginning to observe a dependence of the object's behavior on the observation mode. It sounds like the wording of a report, but in person, it's more jarring. Someone tried to bring the conversation back to normal. Maybe we're creating illusions ourselves with processing. And then they revealed something simple. Raw footage, no alignment, no deconvolution, no enhancers, with different cameras and sensors. The third core form was sitting there, in the same 3 frames. It could be blown away with noise, but it couldn't be drawn by processing in 2 countries at once. It wasn't a filter. It was a trace. Then they did what they usually do only when they are on the verge of panic. They created a map. Which instruments see what? At what moments? With what settings? With what filters? With what tracking? And the line came out too smooth. It turned out that the stick appears more often with one type of exposure and one range of wavelengths, the dot with another, and the double center appears precisely in the interval where the observation is difficult to classify. It's as if the object isn't simply hiding, but offering us 2 ready-made narratives. Viewed this way, it's a comet. Viewed the other way, it's a tiny nucleus, and only when we break the script does it make a mistake. At that moment, an engineer who shouldn't have been in the conversation uttered the coldest remark of the evening. It's not camouflage, it's an interoperability protocol. It's trying to make itself readable in a way that's easier for us. The entire room fell silent because this explained too much at once. Not he's hiding from us, but he's controlling what we can consistently record. This is a different level of control. And then, someone had an idea that reeks of a bad silence. Not looking at an object is better, but the opposite. Looking is worse, but more cunning. Not with one telescope in perfect mode, but with dozens of smaller ones, in chaos. If his masks are tuned to large systems and standard procedures, the chaos of amateurs can become a blind spot for him. Not because they're smarter, but because they're impossible to anticipate. Thus a plan was born that officially never existed. No announcement, no coordination. Just a list of short rules sent out privately. Different filters, different excerpts, different tracking algorithms. The most important rule wasn't about optics, it was about timing. No pretty windows, no synchronized sequences. Everyone shoots when they can, shifting the minute here and there, disrupting the overall structure of observation. And this time, the double center didn't pop up in 3 frames. It popped up in 9. And in the 10th frame, something happened that no one wanted to see because it kills any hope of chance. One of the 2 nodes brightened for a split second, and simultaneously a point source flared nearby. Not off to the side, not in the tail, but in such a geometrical pattern that it seemed connected to the core, like a module to a module. Then the flash disappeared, and the core became a dot again, so pure that it was convenient to show it in the public feed without unnecessary explanation. But the 9 frames had already taken on a life of their own. They couldn't be taken back. From here on, the story stops being about astrophotography and becomes about the system's reaction, because almost immediately the services through which people shared raw materials began to crash. Not globally, but locally, in strange regions. Nothing dramatic, just one server unresponsive, another going down for maintenance, or the CDN suddenly deciding your files are suspicious. But the coincidence was too neat, and then came the most unpleasant blow. Not by images, but by proxy. Several major accounts that usually defend scientific caution suddenly began ridiculing the nuclear substitution theme. You can only laugh at something that's already dangerous. If it were a trivial processing error, no one would waste resources on a synchronous calm down, it's nothing. Errors die on their own when they're checked. Inside a closed chat, someone wrote briefly, almost without emotion, "We are not being convinced, we are being disarmed." And that was a dead giveaway, because what started disappearing next weren't files, but people. One observer deleted their accounts and went into hiding. Another wrote that he had reconsidered his position. A third simply stopped communicating. No one said I was threatened, but the silence spoke louder than words. And at that moment, someone pulled something out of an old crate that had long been deadweight. Telemetry records for the very hour when a large instrument accidentally went into protective mode. The graphs that publicly appeared to be a power failure actually contained a fine, repeating structure. Not noise, not random spikes. A pitch that matched the pitch of the Atlas scanning jets. It sounded like a knock, a short digital rhythm that runs through the system like a test pulse. And if it was a knock, then the most terrifying question was no longer who knocked, but who answered. Because, judging by the footage, there was a response. The double center appeared precisely during the period when this step was active, and then, as soon as the telemetry calmed down, the object returned to its safe mask. People who witnessed this in person suddenly coined a new word. Not comet, not nucleus, not anomaly. They started talking about modes. Mass mode, response mode, agreement mode, silence mode, and if you look at history through modes, it becomes too logical. The object doesn't go crazy. It behaves like a system that can recognize surveillance, assess risk, and emit a controlled signal. And the most annoying thing is, he does it in such a way that we can still argue, so that some people see a stick, others a dot, and a third look like paranoids who overdid the deconvolution. This strategy is ideal because it doesn't require hiding everything. He simply prevents us from getting a single, unified picture in which three things coincide in the same moment and without variation: form, source, and connection. Now imagine you're not the object, but an observer who suddenly realizes your telescope isn't just an eye, it's a flashlight, and when you shine your light, you're seen. Not metaphorically, but literally. That same evening, someone proposed one final test, the simplest and most risky. If the subject normalizes the image to suit us, then we can force them to make a mistake again by changing the rules of the game, not to increase quality, but to change the observation structure so abruptly that it doesn't have time to adjust. A jagged schedule, abrupt filter changes, a chaotic series of short exposures interspersed with long ones. And if at this moment the double center doesn't appear for 9 frames, but lingers longer, then it's not nature. It's a mechanism that hasn't had time to switch over. This will be proof of weakness, and weakness always reveals the device. They called it breaking the mold. Not because it sounds fancy, but because it's easier to keep your head in your hands. If an object truly can adapt, then any perfect observation program is like a poster for it. We decide when and how we'll watch. The plan was unpleasantly simple. No one was creating beautiful sequences for an hour. No one was pursuing quality. Everyone was doing what was usually forbidden in seminars: choppy shutter speeds, jumping filters, different tracking, and most importantly, unpredictable pauses. It felt like sabotaging their own science. But that was the point. If you're catching a butterfly, you don't move smoothly, you jerk. Otherwise, it guesses its trajectory. It's funny, but that's how they first felt like targets, not observers. The first 15 minutes yielded nothing. The target remained a point, obedient and familiar. People began to get irritated, and irritation was more dangerous than panic. Panic is at least honest, while irritation forces people to seek easy explanations. And then, at the 23rd minute mark, something happened that always happens before a real blackout. One of the small telescopes picked up a flickering signal, resembling stray light, and almost immediately the second one, on another continent, saw the same thing in a different band. It wasn't something near the nucleus. It was the sensation of a dot appearing nearby, not sitting in the background. It was clinging not to the stars, but to the object, as if you were looking not at the comet, but at a coordinate system with the comet itself at its center. They tried to blame it on flare, and then they ran the most vicious flare test. They rotated the field, they changed the orientation, changed the optical path, changed everything that usually changes ghosts on the matrix. The dot stayed where it was. It didn't move, didn't fall apart, didn't float around the corner. It behaved like an object attached to another object, which is exactly how a highlight shouldn't behave. At that point, someone said, "Don't touch it, don't improve it," because improvement means predictability again. They left the picture muddy and began to focus on only one thing: repetition and synchronicity. But the synchronicity didn't come from them. It came from Atlas. First, as if by chance, the stream took a step, a tiny change in direction, barely noticeable in a single frame. Then another step, and a third, at regular intervals, like a metronome beating not on the air, but on the fabric of space. When the first person saw it, he didn't believe it. When the second saw it, he felt uneasy. When the third saw it, there was silence, the kind where no one wants to be the first to say the conclusion out loud, because the step wasn't chaotic. It wasn't like the comet spat to the side. It was a sweep. As if the jet weren't ejecting matter, but drawing a line. As if it weren't losing mass, but drawing. And so, at the fourth step, core shape number 3 emerged. That same double shape. Not as an error, not as an artifact, but as strict geometry. 2 brightnesses, 1 center of mass, and a barely noticeable bridge between them. The most disgusting thing about such things isn't that they appear. It's that they appear precisely when you've ceased to be convenient. A second ago, the object was a comet, but in a moment of chaos, it suddenly rips off its mask, and it was then that they experienced that very hour that cannot be explained by the words bad luck. 3 independent instruments in 3 different countries in different bands, with different teams and different processing systems, recorded the same sequence: a jet step, a nearby dot, a double core, and a short flash, confirming it wasn't noise. This combination was too precise. It repeated itself twice within an hour, at the same interval. Nature has cycles, but nature doesn't have the habit of confirming an observation exactly when you're trying to verify it. And here's where the other part of the story kicked in, the one that always begins with someone accidentally becoming unavailable. One of the big tools was supposed to produce the cleanest shot in the middle of that hour. Everything was ready, the clicks were made, the windows were selected, and at exactly that moment it went into protective mode. Not for the night, not for the day, but for exactly the best 20 minutes. Publicly, this will sound like a boring line in a report. Internally, it was different, because the telemetry, which not everyone saw, showed a pattern. Not just a drop, but a series of short pulses, as if the system had first been touched and then shut down on its own. The scariest part was that the pulses matched the exact same scan, not by the second, not perfectly, but by the rhythm, as if someone was testing the response and the system responded with what it does best: retreat to safety. When the big tool disappeared, people thought they'd lost their key piece of evidence. Only later did they realize they'd gotten something else. They got a reaction. A reaction is always information that's hard to fake, because nature doesn't respond to observation schedules, but technology does. And if history contains 2 reacting objects, it's no longer a comet and a telescope. These are 2 intersecting systems. After that hour, everyone was left with one feeling that can't be described with scientific words. It was like standing in the dark, shining a flashlight, and the lights blinking back at you. Not brightly, not loudly, but so loudly that you doubt you even saw it. Doubt was part of the mechanism. It worked perfectly. Some thought it was deconvolution, others weather, still others psychology, and only those who held the 3 independent logs side by side saw the main thing, the structural coincidence. Then they did what people do when they're officially not allowed to do anything. They split the data, not onto one server, not into one folder, but into hundreds of tiny copies in different places with different hashes, different names, different keys, because that same evening the disappearances began, not of files, but of links. Pages temporarily unavailable, archives corrupted, accounts suspicious. Everything was mundane enough to not warrant headlines, yet precise enough to disrupt coordination. And in this pressure, another observation emerged that had previously seemed unimportant. During the double core moments, the nearby point source didn't simply appear. It moved along a microscopic arc, as if orbiting the object at a very small radius. Not a star, not a satellite, not a glint, and not a random asteroid. Because a random object wouldn't be held relative to the core for such a short and precise window. Someone mentioned the word beacon, and it was immediately deleted. The word is too direct, and directness is dangerous, but the meaning remains. The point behaves as an element of the system, not as a background. And then a question arose that's been breaking my sleep. If there's a dot next to Atlas that appears in the window and then disappears, what does it do the rest of the time? Does it hide? Does it go away? Or does it simply become invisible in our mode? And here's where the story comes back to core substitution, because the core looks different isn't just about form. It could be about the display mode. It's as if we're being shown different layers of the same object, depending on how we illuminate it. If so, the dot may not be adjacent. It may be a part, a module, a node. That very element that merges in one mode and separates in another. And the next night, they decided on the most rigorous test yet. Not to observe the object, but to observe its effect on observation. They would bring together telescopes, radar, amateur radio operators, and an old technique commonly used to detect weak signals amidst background noise. They decided to listen to the pauses, because during breaks, when no one is officially watching, the system sometimes relaxes. During breaks, when there are no great episodes, the mask can waver, and if it wavers again, they won't just have an image. They'll have behavior. They stopped shooting, literally. The biggest tools turned off their aggression for an hour. No long bursts, no fanatical stabilization, no habit of stretching the signal to perfection. Instead, they left the subject at the edge of the frame and began looking not at it, but at how the background around it behaved. And then something unpleasant happened. When observations became chaotic, microscopic seams in the data began to appear around Atlas. These weren't matrix stripes or dust. They looked as if the image was being slightly repackaged on the fly, like a stream with a bad internet connection, only without the loss of bitrate. Usually, this kind of thing is attributed to processing, calibration, or their own hands faltering somewhere. But they had a rule. If something is genuine, it will manifest itself the same way in different people, even if they hate each other and use different pipelines. The seams appeared in 3 places, in 3 different cities, and in each case, they appeared when the false star flared up near the object. Not before, not after, but precisely during that brief interval, as if the event triggered a small restructuring around itself. That's when an idea was born. It sounds crazy, but that night it became the only logical one. Not to catch the image, but to catch the protocol. To understand what exactly this mode activates and how it connects to the jets that draw the scan. They started doing things no one usually does publicly. They deliberately kept the observation dirty. They disrupted exposures, changed frequencies, broke predictability. And they watched where the subject began to adjust as if feeling a hand on their collar. The nastiest thing happened on the 3rd cycle. The jet took a step, the false star flared, and at that very moment, the core in one of the frames became not a double, but a triple one, for 1 or 2 seconds. Not 3 spots of noise, but 3 dots, lined up at perfect intervals. It wasn't a glare. A glare doesn't have the habit of maintaining geometry. A glare has no discipline. It's beautiful and stupid. But this one had the discipline of a device, and that's when they realized why core substitution was so infuriating, because it wasn't like the object was different. It was like it was showing different projections of the same structure depending on how you looked at it. Lenses see one thing, a long exposure sees another. Changing filters raises a third. And all of this doesn't resemble a dust cloud, which should behave smoothly and predictably. It's more like a system in which individual elements can switch off and switch on, and then the false star ceased to be just a nearby dot. It became a clue. If it flares synchronously with changes in the behavior of the core and jets, it means it's not a neighboring star. It's a state marker, a mode indicator. The problem was different. You can't prove the regime just by looking at it. You need independent physics. Something that doesn't depend on the camera's artistry or the subtleties of processing. And at that moment, the old map, usually hidden away from the romance of astronomy, was placed back on the table. Radar. Not listen to the radio, not catch a spectrum, but send a pulse and receive a response. Direct, cold, tasteless, and unimaginative. Radar either returns a stable echo or it doesn't. And if it returns an echo from a comet that should be mostly dust, it's no longer a matter of taste. But the radar wasn't civilian. Civilian radar doesn't have that kind of range or power. Civilian radar isn't obligated to remain silent, but military radar is. And yet, someone in that chain turned out to be someone who was tired of playing the game of silence, because that night, a short line appeared on a closed channel, resembling a service note, but with the wrong emotion inside. A stable reflection, not a cloud. They didn't write structure. They didn't write object. They wrote it the way people write when they're afraid of themselves. Not a cloud. That was enough. Things got worse. Because if the radar detects a stable reflection, it means there's a surface or set of surfaces that acts as a reflector, and not just any reflector, but a reflector that maintains its orientation long enough to prevent the echo from spreading. And Atlas's orientation, judging by their scan, wasn't just stable, it was controllable. Step, 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 like a sweep, as if the object were changing the direction of its emissions, not to relieve pressure, but to conduct a sectoral survey. And then the false star made itself known again, but differently. In one of the intervals, it flared not as a dot, but as a tiny cross, barely noticeable, like a microscopic diffraction pattern. However, diffraction shouldn't appear in a clear field if the source is perfect. The cross hinted at geometry, at edges, at a lattice, at something with structure, not a smooth sphere. And most importantly, the cross was identical for 2 people shooting with different lenses. After that, they did something that had previously seemed paranoid. They began comparing not images, but delays. Microscopic time shifts between the flashes of the false star and the steps of the jets. This isn't poetry, it's mathematics. If an object scans, it has a period. A period has been found, not ideal, but stable. It's as if the system is adapting slightly, but maintaining the overall rhythm. As if it's not simply rotating, but executing a cycle. Direct, check, shift, and then someone finally uttered the word everyone had been holding in their teeth to avoid dropping. Beacon, or responder, not in the sense of human technology, but in the sense of principle, a small unit that flares up when the main body switches between modes. If so, the false star might not be an independent satellite. It could be an outlying module at a subtle distance, a point that aids stabilization, or a point that measures the surrounding environment, or a point that looks at us separately from the main body. The most disturbing thing was that this explained the core substitution. If part of the structure is removed and hidden in the background, the core will appear different. not because of different telescopes, but because they illuminate different elements. And then the silence began again, because at the same time, someone tried to block access to the data about a particular night. Not completely, not rudely, subtly. The links were temporary, the files were re-uploaded, the observations were moved. When they close it roughly, it evokes a howl. When they close it subtly, it evokes fear, because they close it subtly only when they don't want to leave a trace. And it was at that moment that the second short line arrived. This time, not about the echo, but about the echo's form. Not a point, 2 peaks. It was like a blow to the table. 2 peaks meant the reflection wasn't coming from a single center, but from at least 2 surfaces separated by a small distance. For a comet, this sounds absurd. For a machine, it sounds banal. Now, the false star is no longer a mystery of the what-if variety. It has become a working hypothesis, an isolated element of the system that sometimes becomes visible when it's performing its function. And since it's sometimes visible, that means it's not always glowing. This means it can be forced to manifest, and then they took the final step before the story ceases to be observation and becomes contact. They decided to provoke the regime, not to deliberately send a signal, but to make the target want to activate its beacon. They began changing their observation patterns synchronously across the globe, not according to NASA's schedule, but according to their own, chaotic yet coordinated. It was as if someone all over the planet were simultaneously making the same gesture. And on the third shared gesture, the false star flared for a second longer than before. Not by much, but long enough for one instrument to detect its spectral shift. The shift was strange, not like a background star, and not like a simple reflection. It looked as if the source wasn't simply shining, but modulating, as if there was a rhythm within the flash. Not a radio transmission in the human sense, more like a trace of activity, a power pulsation. The pulsation of a system that turns on briefly and then turns itself off again, so as not to stick out in our field of vision. At that moment, someone said something that stopped anyone from joking. We don't see the object, we see its interface, the way it presents itself when it performs a function. And that's when the next layer of horror came into play, because if an object has an interface, it doesn't just fly by, it interacts. And if it interacts, the question is no longer what it is. The question is, why is he doing this right next to us?